morning here. Well, it's morning here on the West Coast in the United States. But good morning. Hello. Today, I'm going to be talking about clinical case conceptualization. So if you're joining me live, go ahead and post your name in the comments. Post where you're from, what population you work with. If you're joining me from my Facebook group, just remember you have to give StreamYard permission if you want to, so that I can see your name. It just allows me to see your name. So hello. If you're joining me, go ahead and post your name, where you work, where you're from. Go ahead and post that in the comments. So I'm Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a registered play therapist supervisor with almost 30 years experience in the mental health field. And I love using play therapy and expressive arts with children, adolescents, and families. And to be completely honest, when I work with adults, I have them use art and sand tray as well. You can see my sand figures in the background here. So I go live every Wednesday at 7 a.m. here in the Pacific in the United States. I go live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and in my private Facebook group for mental health professionals using play therapy and expressive arts. It's called Play and Expressive Arts Therapy Playground. Feel free to join me over there. You do have to answer questions in order to be admitted into the group. So today's topic is clinical decision making. Hi, Emily. Emily's in the UK, expressive arts therapist, private practice. Awesome. So glad you're joining today, Emily. That's awesome. So today I want to talk about clinical decision making. I'll be honest, my nerdy self, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Last time I went live, I talked about clinical case conceptualization, which is also one of my other favorite topics to talk about. So today, these kind of go hand in hand. I always think of it as like clinical case conceptualization and clinical decision making go together like peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I love peanut butter and jelly. So they're really critical for each other. And today I want to focus on clinical decision making and what it is and what you need to consider when you are doing the clinical case conceptualization, clinical decision making with your clients, because it's kind of like, I like to use the analogy of GPS. So if you make a turn, but maybe it's not on the path that was decided, your GPS system will come on and say rerouting, because there was a process in place that kind of helps you keep on track. And to me, that's what the decision-making process is, to help you keep on track to accomplish the goals that need to be accomplished in order for your client to get better. And the same is true for play therapy and expressive arts. So that's what I want to talk about today. So what is clinical decision making? It's kind of a fancy term. Essentially, clinical decision making is the process that we use in order to figure out what's going on with our clients and then make decisions about what needs to happen, what kind of interventions, who do we need to talk to, do we need to shift gears, do we need to rethink our treatment approach, all of those things. So, hey, Jennifer's joining us. She works at Red Mountain Counseling. Oh, Southern Utah. Hey, Jennifer. I just did a training there last weekend, which is awesome. Jennifer, I think you were at that training, weren't you? That's awesome. trauma backgrounds with couples, individuals, and adolescents. Most definitely. So clinical decision-making is a really important part of the providing treatment. And that's especially true, I think, with children when we're using some of the more projective modalities like expressive arts and at play therapy. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer said, yes, she was at the training. Thank you for the kind words. That was such a great training. I really enjoyed that training as well. We talked about trauma and using play therapy and expressive arts with adolescents and children. And so Southern Utah, if you've never been to Southern Utah, it is absolutely beautiful. I love it there. It's so pretty. And we here in the desert are under triple digits. We're in double digits these days. So next week, we're supposed to get into the 80s, which will be really nice. We're in the 90s this week, which is cool. All right, so back on track. So clinical decision-making is basically what our decision-making process is to figure out, are we meeting the right targets in treatment? What's going on with our client? How we decide what interventions to use and why we're going to use them. And so some of the things that you want to make sure to consider when you are doing your clinical decision-making process. So these are kind of a broad, these are the ones that I usually keep in mind when I am deciding what's going on and helping me navigate the treatment process with my clients to help them really heal and resolve whatever the issues are that are bringing them into the treatment process. So first and foremost, one of the things I think is really critical, and this is the part that ties clinical decision-making to case conceptualization, which is I have to understand what are the roots of my client's behavior. And if you feel free to go back, you can go back and listen to my live episode, the replay, where I do talk a little more in depth about roots in my previous episode, live episode. But we have to figure out what are the roots of our client's behavior, because that's going to help me figure out what interventions that I need to use. The other thing is I need to think about what are the developmental needs of my client. To me, this is really important. Most of us use an integrated toolbox, so to speak, and based on the developmental needs of our clients, we may decide to use one type of treatment model or intervention versus another. For example, if I'm working with a child who is 4 years old, 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7, 8-ish, the likelihood I'm going to use child-centered play therapy is really high, because child-centered play therapy allows the child to take the lead, and I can use that treatment approach to help me get a better sense of what's going on with them, as well as based on that theory model, given the free and protected space and using and applying that model the way it's supposed to be applied, then I can help my client using the therapeutic powers of play and relationship, because the relationship is key in that model, to help them resolve the issues that are going on with them. So if I have a really young client, I'm going to use child-centered play therapy. And let's say I have a client who's 9 or 10, and let's say they've experienced trauma or even grief. If you're working with clients who've experienced trauma, they're also going to be working with grief. If they've experienced grief, it's not necessarily going to involve trauma. And if you have a client who's experienced trauma, they most definitely will also need to resolve some grief issues. So let's say I have a client who's experiencing trauma and they're 9-year-old. So a 9-year-old is going to have more cognitive abilities than like a 4 or 5-year-old to articulate what's going on with their thoughts and feelings. And I can use some more directive activities with them. So if based on those developmental needs, the likelihood I'm going to use more directive approaches is pretty high. The likelihood I'm going to use a trauma-informed framework is pretty high if I'm working with someone with trauma, which means for children, like a 9-year-old child and above, 8 even, sometimes 7, depends on their cognitive abilities and their ability to articulate. So you got to think about all of those things and their willingness to engage in a more directive approach. So for instance, I will probably use directive approaches I have to do some cognitive restructuring. So I have to identify what are their cognitive distortions. To do that, I can use some directive interventions. And I want to use directive interventions that are using some of those therapeutic powers of play, because developmentally, a 9-year-old is going to respond much more effectively to go to those deeper levels, deeper emotional levels, if I'm using something developmentally geared toward what is helpful for them. And play is helpful for them. Every once in a while, this is rare, it does happen. Every once in a while, I do get a client who just wants to sit and chat. So I will sit and chat, and we'll do more talking than playing. Again, that's based on their developmental needs. So developmentally, this is a child person who has more access to language, and they like to use their language. I'll usually integrate in play as well, because I do think it helps, even with the rare child who would rather talk than play. There's not a lot of those. So the other thing is, so I'm looking at what are the roots of my clients' behaviors. I'm also thinking about what are their developmental needs, what they're capable of, because I can have a child who may be chronologically 10 or 11, maybe socially, emotionally, they may be more like 7 or 8. If they're socially and emotionally more 7 or 8, the likelihood I'm going to use a lot more play-based interventions more than talking is pretty high. And I may use child-centered play therapy, because that may be a modality that they'll fully engage in more, and I won't get as much shutting down in the session or kind of defiance, like they'll refuse to do it. So Emily asks, let me go change out my banner here. Playing around with my live stream here platform. Do I work with many teens? Yes, I've worked with a lot of teenagers. Teenagers and the developmental needs of teenagers, that's a great question. So developmentally, teenagers, in order to get them to engage, you really need to talk to them first. Children, in order to get children to engage, you typically need to play with them first, so that they'll get more comfortable with you in the play. With adolescents, I find that if I engage verbally with them first and establish some therapeutic rapport, that safety and security in the session, then they're more likely to use some of the more expressive arts like art or Santre. I love using poetry, music, those kinds of things. So yes, that based on developmental needs with a teenager, I know that's my clinical decision making. I know I need to first talk with them and help them feel safe and secure. Getting to know me, I get to know them a little bit through just kind of talking, how's things going first before I can get them to play. So that the other thing is, identifying the roots. Emily says, thanks. Identifying the roots, identifying the developmental needs. And then the other thing is identifying what a theory model. So most of us as mental health professionals, most of us have what I would call a toolbox a clinical toolbox that we have. And that toolbox is made up of the type of supervision and model we were taught through our supervisors, the type of trainings that we've gone through, the type of clients that we've worked with. So most of us have developed more of an integrated approach. And because we have an integrated approach, we have what I call a clinical toolbox. So this is where clinical decision-making is really important as well, because what I'm doing is thinking about what tool in my toolbox I'm going to be using for my specific clients, based on personality wiring, based on developmental needs, based on the roots of what's going on for them underneath their behavior. I'm going to be, because kids some are their personality wiring. Some of them are more quiet and introverted. Some of them are more active. And like middle school boys, still, if you do more active play-based interventions, they're going to engage more. Girls, I can typically get them to engage more during adolescence using art and Santre. 9-year-old girls and boys, Santre, I can usually get them to engage using those modalities. So I'm thinking about some of their personalities and their developmental needs, where they are, how verbal they are, how nonverbal they are. Then I'm going to go into my toolbox and think about which of those tools will be most effective. And so the tools might be, for me, Santre is a tool, art is a tool, poetry is a tool, child-centered play therapy is a tool, cognitive behavioral therapy will be the theory underlying maybe one of the interventions that I do, especially if it's focused on identifying cognitive distortions and then challenging those cognitive distortions and coming up with some of that cognitive restructuring. Underneath the intervention, there's going to be a theoretical model that kind of drives that intervention. So I think about what theory model is underneath the intervention that I'm going to be using, because theory drives application. And I need to be mindful of that when I'm doing my decision-making, which particular theory model might work more effectively with a particular client. Emily, that's a great point. Working with attachment theory. That's one of my faves. I use attachment theory all the time, attachment theory and neurobiology. So I'm thinking about, and that's the other thing, because I'm working with children and adolescents. The other thing that I want to think about is, how am I going to involve the parents? That is part of my clinical decision-making process. And I tend to like to use an attachment framework. And I also kind of integrate attachment theory, neurobiology, and some family systems, because I like to look at the child, even the adolescent, within the context of their life, so to speak. So that would include family, that would include school, that would include friends. All of that is in context. That's all part of my clinical decision-making. Who's going to be involved in the treatment process? And what's the reason I want to involve them in the treatment process? And a lot of that, then I'm going to have to think about what theory model is going to help me create the framework that's going to help me navigate through that treatment process using my clinical decision-making. So for example, if I'm thinking about parents, how I'm thinking about how often the parent needs to be involved. So how effective, how much support do parents need for parenting, how well developed or how effective are their parenting skills with what's going on with their child. Because in the beginning, I may need to meet with parents more often in a session without the child in order to help them develop skills that are going to be more effective to meet the needs of their child. I may want to bring in siblings. I may want to have sibling sessions to help resolve some of the conflict that may be going on between them, and also provide more support, strengthening those relationships to help them in the long term. Because I'm only a brief moment in my client's life. So what I want to do is, I always tell my clients, my job is to work myself out of a job, which is weird to say. My job is to help you not need to come to therapy anymore. So we're going to be thinking about what you need in order for things to be better in your life, that you don't need to come anymore. And for me, that it definitely involves the parents, because they're going to be in their child's life. Hopefully, the plan is the rest of their lives together. Parents are going to be there much, much longer than me. Siblings are going to be there much longer than me. So I would want to strengthen those relationships. So that's part of my clinical decision making. How often do I want to meet with parents? What's that going to look like? What type of parenting approach do I need to help them with? I tend to default to neuroscience and attachment theory when I'm working with parents, and help use parent skills using that theory model. If I'm working with a child who's got a pretty significant ADHD and or autism spectrum, then I need to help them understand and learn some strategies that are going to be effective with a child that's not neurotypically developing. That's a much different approach to parenting than your typically developing child. And in many ways, I still like to use an attachment framework, though. So we want to think about what theory model are the tools in my toolbox, and which tool out of that toolbox I want to use. When I use an intervention, I definitely want to make sure I understand what the theory model is that is underneath that intervention. And I want to be flexible to adjust as I'm needed to make sure the interventions that I'm using are going to be effective. So that to me is the final thing for today, which is it working? We need to think about that. Is this intervention working? Is it effective? Because I can't tell you how many times I've thought, okay, I'm going to use this one. It's going to work. I use it. It doesn't work very well. So then I adjust. And that's part of that decision making, adjusting. What do I need to adjust? What might be more effective? I actually also, for not the really young ones, if I'm using child-centered play therapy, I won't ask them questions. But especially in the beginning, if I'm getting started with some really anxious teenagers, if they've experienced trauma, at the end of the session, if I'm working with let's say a teenager or a 9-year-old, I may ask them, how was this for you? I promise you're not going to hurt my feelings. The more feedback you give me, the more helpful I can be. So how was this for you? What was helpful? Was there anything that wasn't helpful? That feedback, I think, is really important to make sure that we are meeting their needs the way that they need them to be met. And the clinical decision making is, if it's not working, what's the reason that it's not working? And sometimes the reason it's not working is because we are not, with the child, maybe we need to get the parent much more involved in the treatment process. And we need to be able to communicate that to parents in order to help them engage more into the treatment process, into the change process. So I'm going to give a quick kind of clinical example fix my notes there. Let me share my screen. It's been a while, so I'm hoping I do this right. All right, here we go. Sharing my screen, hoping that it works. All right, so far so good. Okay, I think it's working. So now I want to go here. And I think, so let's say, if I'm looking at the roots, and this is part of my clinical decision making, I want to identify some of the roots. So if I have a child that's coming in with emotion dysregulation, I want to find out what is underneath that emotion dysregulation. It could be so many different things, like autism spectrum. They struggle with cognitive inflexibility. It's hard for them to shift gears. They do not do social reciprocity well. They look like they're really self-centered and it's all about them because they don't know really how to think about things from the other person's point of view and understand that not everybody likes the same things I like. And the other thing is, if they're on the autism spectrum, then most definitely they're going to be struggling with some sensory processing. So maybe their sensory system is getting overwhelmed. These are all the things that I want to think about, the roots of the behavior, because if I'm doing my decision making and I'm thinking, okay, we're dealing with some cognitive inflexibility, that I'm going to approach that differently than if it was maybe depression and they're struggling with significant feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, irritability, crankiness. That's going to be a different approach in many ways. There's some overlaps with identifying thoughts and cognitive distortions. We can still do some of that if the child is a little older on the autism spectrum. And again, developmental needs, what's their capabilities? Can they, like a middle school child who's on the spectrum, I could probably do some exploring of what their thoughts are, any cognitive distortions. If they're on the autism spectrum, I'm probably going to be teaching them some social skills and use some activities to talk about social skills, social reciprocity. When they get kind of stuck in their inflexibility, they're going to need some coping skills to help them to regulate, calm down so they don't get so irritable and overwhelmed. Teach them some of those cognitive, some coping skills for that. Let's say they're experiencing anxiety. So with anxiety, we're most definitely looking at cognitive distortions that are activating that fear response. So what's activating their anxiety? Because anxiety is thinking there's a threat when there's actually probably not a real threat. With trauma, they're assessing for threat. They get triggered because they've assessed a threat. That's a little bit different because for them, a trauma did happen. Something unsafe did happen. And so their neurocircuitry got activated because something did happen. With anxiety, it probably is something that they're anxious about that will happen and most likely may not happen. So for example, I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with, usually around 9 or 10, and they have some irrational fears, such as like, here in the US, we have these vents for the air conditioning and heating. So they're probably 6 inches by 12 inches wide and kind of helps with the airflow in the house. And one of the irrational fears with the anxiety, we did identify cognitive distortions. So here's a cognitive distortion that was identified, which is a bad guy is going to crawl through the vent. It's like this big, going to crawl through the vent and murder me and my family, and we're all going to die. So then we can use some play-based interventions to identify the cognitive distortions and then go through the process of challenging those cognitive distortions and helping them develop what I call the truth. What's the truth? The lie is a bad guy's going to crawl through the vent and kill me and my family. The truth is, well, if I think about how big my dad is, pretty sure my dad wouldn't be able to crawl through that little vent. So the truth is the bad guy's not going to fit through there, which means he can't come in through the vent and kill me and my family. That's just one example. There's a bunch more, and there's a process to go through. But my decision making is for anxiety, I'm going to use a cognitive behavioral type of intervention so we can challenge those cognitive distortions that are activating the fear response. So the other thing is, if these are some of the other things that can create vulnerabilities for emotion regulation. So if I go back to the roots, I'm looking at some of these things, and let's say I have a child with attention deficit disorder that I'm working with. Play therapy is not going to fix the ADHD. That's not going to happen. But what it can do is help them with regulating their emotions, dealing with some of the anxiety and self-esteem issues, or maybe even depression that come along with the ADHD. We can help them learn some coping skills to help them stop and think before they act. Most definitely, part of my clinical decision-making is I'm going to be helping parents to develop some parenting skills that are going to be more effective with their child. So these are all the things that I'm thinking about. I'm identifying the roots of it. Is there self-esteem? Do I need to help teach them some skills for inhibiting? Do I need to teach them some skills and address some of the anxiety that comes with ADHD sometimes, not all the time? And then I'm going to choose my interventions based on what I've identified are those roots that are going on. I'm thinking about the age of my client and making decisions about some of those things. All right, so let me stop sharing my screen. There we go. I think I have stopped sharing my screen. Hopefully that worked. So those are those are some of the things that I think about when I'm deciding on interventions. Those are some of the roots of behaviors that can happen. And then I identify and target what it is that I need to address. For example, ADHD, any of those things. Do they have depression? Do they have anxiety? Do they have emotion regulation? And does that have a lot to do with some of that neurocircuitry not being really well developed? I'm going to be wanting to help teach them some coping skills. I'm going to want to help parents and teach them some effective parenting skills to work with that child. Those are all part of my clinical decision making. So as a recap, clinical decision making is a crucial part of providing play therapy and expressive arts because it's going to help me figure out what interventions are going to target the issues that need to be addressed with my client. And then I'm going to adjust as I go along because I'm going to be thinking about, okay, is this working? Is it not working? I'm going to be getting to know my client better to see if there were other things that I didn't identify early on. And if that's the case, I'm going to be deciding what do I need to do to help them as I'm learning more about my client, what interventions are going to be more effective given their developmental needs, giving what are the presenting issues, given how much I need to involve parents. So I'm going to be making all of those decisions. And understanding all of these decision-making components really helps me to navigate the treatment process a lot more effectively because it's an ongoing process. We're always doing that clinical decision-making throughout the treatment process. That's part of our ethical decision-making. Ethical decision-making is making sure we're targeting the right issues, that we're making decisions that are based on best practices, and we're maintaining privacy, which comes into play when you're working with children and adolescents. Because what do you tell parents? When do you tell parents? What do you not tell parents? If they're just meeting with their child for individual. So all of that ethical decision making is most definitely kind of hand in hand with clinical decision making, because if I have chosen a specific intervention or I've chosen to involve more family members in the treatment process, and I've got to navigate those boundaries. Because the other thing is, when I'm also part of that clinical decision making with children and adolescents, is who else do I involve in the treatment process? Children, I like to think of children existing within their context. School is a huge part of their life. I always ask how school is going. That's because part of my decision making is, if school is a major contributing factor to their mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, maybe they've got ADHD or they're on the autism spectrum, then most definitely integrating some way, how are we going to manage that school part? I can teach parents how to advocate with school personnel, and I can do some coaching around that. I can have conversations with the school counselor or school social worker. I can have meeting with parents and school counselor and myself, and we can come up with a plan. I can help parents talk to school counselors about coming up with the plan and then letting me know what the plan is. So all of those things, we're navigating different boundaries, we're navigating different systems. All of those things are helping me to decide, based on what's going on with my client, what kind of decisions am I making and what kind of recommendations am I giving to parents. Alrighty, well, that's it for today. I'm so glad you were able to join today. If you're watching on the replay, feel free to post your name, where you're from, questions. So what play therapy models do you use? And post in the comments, how do you decide which one you're going to use in the comments? Also, if you found this helpful, please like it and share it across your social media platforms. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free, or you're not watching on YouTube, but you want to go to my YouTube channel, then go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll be notified when I go live on my YouTube channel. Eventually, I'll have videos on there. I don't have any yet. I haven't gotten there yet. But when I do have some, if you're subscribed, you'll get notified once I do that. I'm hoping to actually put some of those on there, some videos in the next 2 or 3 months. I have to make them first. It takes a while. So if you're interested, I have an online play therapy supervision group. We meet twice a month on the second and fourth Saturday of each month. I do have a couple of openings left in that group. Right now, I have kind of a back to school special. It's $45 per group. And then beginning October 1st, that price does go up. But if you sign up and get registered to reserve your spot before the end of September. Then you get that $45 cost. So if you're interested in that, feel free to private message me or post something in the comments, and we'll set up a time and I can talk with you more about the group. All right, so that's it for this week, and I will see you next time. Bye.